This is Judge Herb Dodell. Probably the most important thing we're hearing lately is about the Supreme Court. The term is used regularly, but a lot of people don't know what the Supreme Court really does. We know it's the highest court in the land. We know that it deals with federal issues, mainly interpretation of the Constitution. If you go back in American history to the very, very beginning, the Federalist Papers and otherwise, there was always a dispute as to whether the Supreme Court was to be used as a legislative body by being flexible in its interpretations. It's called an active court, or whether or not it should be strict constructionists. There were certain people who ran for president who took that role, had to be strictly construed. In fact, that's mainly what the discussion is right now in terms of who gets selected to sit on the Supreme Court. As you probably know from watching the news, Supreme Court justices, they're called justices, not judges, Supreme Court justices are selected by the president constitutionally. And that's why when I talked about Kavanaugh in a recent YouTube, if it turns out that this investigation comes up with nothing that he did that was illegal or that he didn't lie or anything of that nature, then he should be confirmed, because that's what a president's obligation is to do under the Constitution. If, on the other hand, it turns out to the contrary, then he shouldn't be confirmed, because we should hold these justices to the highest possible standards, because they make the law. They're the last stop. So you say, well, why does a case get to the Supreme Court? How does it get to the Supreme Court? What if I have a case in local municipal court, but it involves the interpretation of a statute or an ordinance? Well, that case could end up actually in the United States Supreme Court, but it has to go through a whole series of what's called intermediary courts. In a typical Superior Court case, in California, for example, the next step is through the appellate process in the state court. That means the Court of Appeals. In some states it's called something different, and ultimately to the Supreme Court of the state in which that case was heard. But if it involves constitutional issues or interpretation of the Constitution, you may get it pushed into the federal district court. If a case is heard in the federal district court, and there the judges are also appointed by the president and have to be confirmed by the Senate, that's the court that is basically a trial court in the federal system. From there, you go to the circuit court. Judge Kavanaugh comes from the circuit court in D.C. In California, the circuit court is the Ninth Circuit, and there are, I recall, somewhere like 20 some odd justices of the circuit. And in cases that are heard before that court, there are 3 justices, or judges, they are called judges, and there are occasions when all of the judges in that district participate in a decision, and that's called en banc, E-N, next word, B-A-N-C. And from the Court of Appeals, the Circuit Court of Appeals, the next and last stop is the Supreme Court, and they can decide whether they want to hear a case or not. It's the same in the state court. The Supreme Court can decide whether they want to hear a case or not. The intermediary courts, the courts of appeal, must hear the cases as long as timely filings were made and all the rules have been followed. So it goes to the Supreme Court. There are 9 justices of the Supreme Court. The big battle right now is because there's a 4-4 split. Generally, there are 4 conservative justices. That would be Justice Thomas. That's Justice Roberts, Chief Justice Roberts. That's Justice Alito. That's Justice Gorsuch. On the liberal side, or the moderate side, or the progressive side, is Justice Ginsburg. And by the way, that was a great show that did on her life. Fascinating. Justice Kagan, Justice Sotomayor, and Justice Breyer. And this is the vacancy for the 9th spot, which came about as a result of the retirement of Justice Kennedy, which unfortunately came along at the wrong time, as it's made all this hoopla just before the midterm elections. This is a big deal, because once they decide, that's the law of the land. And one of the big concerns, of course, is the decision of Roe versus Wade, which allows abortions under certain circumstances. That's what's at stake in this appointment, and that's why you hear all what you're hearing. You didn't hear that before when Justice Kagan was nominated, or Justice Alito, or even Chief Justice Roberts. Now it's a hot subject. If they turn down any cases that they don't want to hear, people make what's called a writ of certiorari. That's the term, certiorari. Court has discretion to either hear it or not. If they decide not, it means that the decision that was made in the intermediate appellate court remains the decision, and that's what's binding. You want to know more about it? Listen to the show. For the people, go to judgeherbdodell.us, hit radio shows, pick one that you find as interesting, pick more, and you're going to learn something. So we'll see you again next time.